In 1975, the United States Senate discovered that its own government had been running assassination programs against foreign leaders, had been conducting illegal surveillance on American citizens for decades, including civil rights leaders, sitting senators, and Supreme Court justices, had been opening and reading private mail, had been infiltrating domestic political organizations, had been maintaining secret files on over 1 million American citizens, had been running a mind control program on unwitting human subjects, had been conducting covert operations so far outside the law that senior senators, upon hearing the classified briefings, reportedly sat in silence for several minutes before they could speak. Senator Frank Church, the Idaho Democrat who chaired the investigation, held up a CIA dart gun on live television and said the American people had the right to know that their government had been operating for 30 years without any meaningful oversight or accountability whatsoever. The investigation lasted over a year. It produced 14 reports. It named names. It documented crimes. And within 18 months of its conclusion, the momentum was gone. The accountability was absent. The people responsible had faced almost no consequences, and the institutions that have been exposed had quietly resumed their operations under new names and slightly revised authorities. This is the story of the Church Committee. The one time America held a mirror up to its shadow institutions, and then looked away.
To understand why the Church Committee happened, you have to understand what 1975 America felt like. It was a nation that had just watched its president resign in disgrace. Watergate had shattered something fundamental in the American public's relationship with their government. For the first time in the post-war era, the assumption that the institutions of American democracy were fundamentally trustworthy had been broken. And into that broken trust stepped a New York Times reporter named Seymour Hersh. On December 22, 1974, Hersh published a front-page story that would change the course of American history. The headline read, "Huge CIA operation reported in U.S. against anti-war forces, other dissidents." Hersh had obtained evidence that the CIA, whose founding charter explicitly prohibited domestic operations, had been running a massive illegal surveillance program inside the United States, targeting anti-war protesters, targeting civil rights organizations, targeting journalists, targeting politicians. The program had a name inside the CIA, Operation Chaos. It had been running since 1967. It had compiled files on over 7,000 American citizens. The CIA had been spying on Americans illegally for 7 years, and nobody outside the agency had known. The reaction in Washington was volcanic. Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield immediately called for a congressional investigation. The Senate voted 82-4 to establish a special select committee. Senator Frank Church of Idaho was appointed chairman. What he and his colleagues were about to find inside the classified vaults of the CIA, FBI, NSA, and the military intelligence services was beyond what they had imagined.
Before I tell you what they found, I want you to understand something about Frank Church. He was not a radical. He was not a conspiracy theorist. He was not someone looking to tear down American institutions for ideological reasons. He was a decorated World War II veteran, a mainstream Democrat from a conservative Western state, a man who had spent his career working within the system, genuinely believing in American institutions. What he found in those classified files changed him. By the end of the investigation, Church said publicly that the CIA had become, and I am using his exact words, a rogue elephant operating outside any democratic control. When a decorated war veteran and lifelong institutionalist uses the phrase rogue elephant to describe his own government's intelligence apparatus, you should probably pay attention to what he found.
The Church Committee's findings were released across 14 volumes of reports. Here, in plain language, is what they documented. The Assassination Plots. The CIA had developed active plots to assassinate at least 8 foreign leaders. Fidel Castro of Cuba, with plans ranging from poisoned cigars to exploding cell shells to the use of mafia hitmen. Patrice Lumumba of the Congo, against whom a CIA officer was dispatched carrying a kit of biological agents intended to be introduced into his food or toothbrush. Ngo Dinh Diem of South Vietnam, General René Schneider of Chile, Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic. These were not contingency plans sitting in a filing cabinet. They were active operational programs with code names, with budgets, with CIA officers in the field. Sanctioned, the committee found, by the highest levels of the CIA, and in several cases with presidential knowledge. The domestic surveillance. The FBI's COINTELPRO program, which had been running since 1956, had conducted systematic campaigns against American political organizations the FBI deemed subversive. The targets included the Communist Party, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Black Panther Party, the American Indian Movement, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization. The FBI had wiretapped King's phones, had surveilled his hotel rooms, had sent him an anonymous letter confirmed by the committee urging him to commit suicide, signed with fake names, mailed by FBI agents. The FBI sent Martin Luther King Jr. a letter telling him to kill himself. This is in the congressional record. The mail opening. From 1953 to 1973, the CIA conducted a program called HT Lingual, secretly opening and reading first-class mail between the United States and the Soviet Union. Over the program's 20-year life, it opened and photographed approximately 215,000 pieces of private mail. The recipients included senators, businessmen, academics, ordinary citizens, all without a warrant, all without legal authority. The NSA surveillance. The National Security Agency, which most Americans in 1975 had never heard of, had been monitoring the international communications of American citizens since the 1960s. Under a program called Operation Shamrock, it had obtained direct access to the international telegraph traffic passing through major American communications companies, Western Union, RCA, ITT, and had been reading that traffic for 30 years.
I want to be very precise about the timeline here, because it matters enormously. COINTELPRO began in 1956, under Eisenhower. The mail opening program began in 1953, under Eisenhower. The NSA surveillance program began in the late 1940s, under Truman. These programs ran continuously through Democratic and Republican administrations alike, through Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. They were not the project of one party or one president. They were the project of institutions that had decided at some point in their early history that the constitutional rights of American citizens were an obstacle to their mission and had simply decided to work around them. For 30 years, while American citizens voted in elections, paid their taxes, and trusted that the government they were funding was operating within the law, it was not. The Church Committee concluded its work in 1976. Its recommendations were significant. It called for permanent oversight committees in both the Senate and the House, committees that would have ongoing access to intelligence activities and the authority to investigate abuses. It called for a legislative charter for the CIA that would clearly define and limit its authorities. It called for strict legal controls on domestic surveillance. Some of these reforms were implemented. The Senate Intelligence Committee was established. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, was passed in 1978, creating a special court to oversee domestic surveillance warrants. These were genuine reforms. And then the momentum stopped. The CIA's legislative charter, the binding legal framework that would have permanently defined and limited what the agency could do, was never passed. It was debated for years and then quietly abandoned. The directors of the CIA and FBI who had overseen the programs documented by the committee faced almost no legal consequences. William Colby, the CIA director who had cooperated with the investigation and authorized the release of the Family Jewels documents, the CIA's own internal summary of its worst abuses, was fired by President Ford and replaced with George H.W. Bush, who moved quickly to limit further disclosures. The officials who had authorized and overseen assassination plots, illegal surveillance, and mail opening retired on government pensions. James Angleton, the CIA's chief of counterintelligence, who had personally overseen the mail opening program for 20 years, resigned quietly and lived the rest of his life in private. Richard Helms, who had ordered the destruction of the MK Ultra files, paid his $2,000 fine and went on to a comfortable retirement. The COINTELPRO operatives who had sent Martin Luther King Jr. a letter urging him to kill himself were never charged with any crime. By 1980, just 5 years after the Church Committee had exposed the deepest abuses in American intelligence history, Ronald Reagan had been elected on a platform that included explicitly rebuilding and strengthening the CIA. William Casey became CIA director. The budget expanded. The covert programs resumed. The Church Committee had opened the window. The window had been quietly closed again. Senator Frank Church died of pancreatic cancer in 1984. He was 59 years old. In his final years, he expressed, in interviews that received little coverage, a deep frustration that the momentum of the committee's work had dissipated so completely. He had believed in 1975 that exposure would lead to accountability, that accountability would lead to reform, that reform would lead to institutions that were genuinely answerable to the people they served. He was wrong. Not because the exposure was insufficient, not because the evidence was weak, but because the institutions that had been exposed had something the committee did not. They had time. They had resources. They had the patience of organizations that had been operating for decades and understood that congressional attention, like all political attention, is temporary. You wait. You cooperate just enough. You give the reformers their headlines and their hearings, and then you wait for the headlines to move on. They always do. 9 episodes, 9 institutions,
1 consistent pattern. Power operates in the space between what citizens are told and what actually happens, between the government that appears on television and the government that makes the decisions that shape your life. The Church Committee is the most important episode in this entire series because it is the story of what happens when the gap becomes visible. When ordinary people, senators, journalists, citizens look directly at the machinery behind the curtain. And what it tells us is this: exposure by itself changes nothing. The Church Committee found everything, named everything,
documented everything, and the institutions it exposed are still operating today. In our final episode of this series, we ask the question that all of this has been building toward. What if it had gone differently? What if in 1975 the accountability had held? What if the legislative charter had passed? What if the momentum had not collapsed? What would America look like right now if the Church Committee had actually succeeded? That story, the one that never happened, is next episode.